Hey everybody, I'm Jessica Day George. I'm the New York Times bestselling author of 16 books now, including this brand newest 16th, which is The Writer's Reign. And I'm here to talk to you, though, about fairy tales and see how quick we can give you a little advice on how to retell a fairy tale. Because some of my first books were retold fairy tales, and fairy tales are very dear to my heart. Um, these were some of my first books: Princess of the Silver Woods, Princess of Glass, Princess of the Midnight Ball, and my precious baby, Sun and Moon, Ice and Snow, which is based on my favorite fairy tale, East of the Sun, West of the Moon. And I started working on this book when I was about 13 years old, when I first decided to be a writer, and so I was really excited to get to turn it into a real live book. So that is what I was known for, kind of, at the beginning of my career. And so I like to talk to people about how to retell fairy tales. I'm also a huge reader of fairy tales. These are two of my favorites. I'm currently rereading Tamlyn right now as a comfort read. Love that book so much. So let's talk about how to retell a fairy tale. There's the first thing you have to do when you're retelling a fairy tale is figure out if it is a fairy tale. And I say this, and I know this seems super odd, and I'm sure you guys are fine and don't have this problem, but quite a lot of the time when people say, oh, I'm retelling a fairy tale, and I'll say, oh, which fairy tale? And they'll say, oh, Alice in Wonderland, or somebody once said Jane Eyre to me. I'm retelling a fairy tale, and I'm like, oh, which fairy tale? Jane Eyre. Jane Eyre is not a fairy tale, although you can do some fantastic retellings of it, just not a fairy tale. So, it's just a nitpick that I have. But you need to figure out what it is that you're retelling. If there's a story that's dear to your heart, Jane Eyre, Alice in Wonderland, Theseus and the Minotaur, Sun and Moon, Ice and Snow, or, sorry, that's my book, Snow White, Rose Red, Little Red Riding Hood, whatever your favorite story is, if you want to do your own version of it, that is great. Figure out what it is, but the thing you need to figure out is, do you have the right to do that? The Brothers Grimm were long dead, and they were only collecting stories. So you're free to take anything from the Brothers Grimm and turn it into your own story. Ditto Greek myths, Norse myths, any mythology from all around the world, folk and fairy tales and legends from all around the world. Legends like John Henry or like Brer Rabbit and stories like those. You're free to retell those. They don't really belong to anyone. Also, older novels, Jane Eyre, Alice in Wonderland, all of those are sort of into the public domain now, and so you can take whatever liberties you want with them, within reason. If you're going to quote directly from a version of it, like if you're going to take a huge chunk of Alice in Wonderland or the Jabberwocky poem or something like that, you do in fact need to figure out what the rights and permissions are. You need to do something like that. If you want to tell your own version of Harry Potter, or if you want to talk about Greek myths but specifically use the characters from Percy Jackson, you are going to have to talk to the authors still living of those books and try to get the rights to write a sequel or whatever it is, which is, let's face it, very unlikely. So know what you're looking at, first of all. And then the second thing that you need to look at is what kind of story you're trying to tell. And I've broken this down into two categories. There's two ways to tell a fairy tale, retell a fairy tale. And I'm just going to use fairy tale as a catch-all. You might be talking about a Greek myth or an Indonesian folk legend or something like that. But I'm just going to say fairy tale. There's two ways to tell them, according to moi. There is straight, the very straightforward way of telling a story. If you don't know this, Patricia Reedy, who also wrote the wonderful Enchanted Forest Chronicles, which I would argue are sort of crooked retellings of fairy tales, which is the other kind. But this is a very straightforward retelling of Snow White and Rose Red. You've got the two sisters. They have the two attributes that they're known for in their story. You have the bear, who is a man transformed. It's also similar to East of the Sun, West of the Moon. It's my favorite type of story. It's sort of a Beauty and the Beast type of story. This is very straightforward. It's a medieval time period. All the things that the instant you read this book, even if you didn't see the cover, you would know that this was a retelling of this story, if you know this story. Then we have my other fave, Tamlyn by Pamela Dean. Tamlyn is actually not a fairy tale per se. It is an old ballad about young Janet from Carterhaugh who goes to pick red, red roses and falls in love with Tamlyn, and Tamlyn belongs to the Fairy Queen, and every 7 years, to keep her youth and beauty, the Fairy Queen has to send one of her favorites of her court to hell to pay the price for her immortal youth and beauty. And she has selected young Tamlyn that year to be the sacrifice, and Janet is in love with him as well. So it's a ballad, and the ballad's included at the back of this, but the rest of this story is set in the 1970s, right at the end of the Vietnam War, at a small liberal arts college in Minnesota, and is about a girl named Janet Carter and her friends, including the strange and enigmatic Thomas Lane, who is very handsome, and the professors are weird, and there's a whole thing going on, but there's also lots of Shakespeare quotes and all kinds of fun things going on, and people wearing bell-bottoms and smoking pot, because they're at college. So this is what I would call a crooked retelling of a story. If you don't know the Ballad of Tamlyn, you are completely taken by surprise with what happens at the end of this book. The whole first part is just kids settling into college and her meeting her roommates and becoming friends and getting a boyfriend and taking classes to study English and things like that. Those are all the things that she has going on. And then suddenly the magic starts creeping in. It's a very different way of telling a fairy tale, and I love it to pieces. So those are the things you need to decide. What story are you doing? Do you have the right to do that story? Do you want to do a straightforward retelling? If you're going to do a straightforward retelling, you're going to need to do some background research. You're going to need to know, okay, if I'm doing Germany in the 14th century, you're going to need to look into clothes, food, all kinds of things like that, and do your research so that you've got a solid historical background in it. If you're going to do something more like this, you can, as Pamela Dean did, base it on your own experiences at college in the 1970s in a small liberal arts college in the Midwest. So those are kind of your two options, and that's what your research is going to depend on. Tons and tons of literary allusions in this one, so she's clearly done a lot of research, lots of quotes, lots of fun things about the theater and poetry and all sorts of things like that she would have done research on, whereas this one very accurately describes what it would be like to live in a small cottage in the Middle Ages. So you need to do a lot of research for things like that. And it really depends, your names, your language, everything needs to be accurate, especially if you're doing a more historical setting. You can be a little more free if you're doing sort of a twisted tale that's a modern setting. Obviously, you know what a modern setting is going to look like for you anyway. Or if you're doing a futuristic setting, if you're doing Little Red Riding Hood in space and it turns out that, it's her spacesuits that's red and Grandma is actually the head of the Rebel Alliance or something like that, you might want to do some research into science, which is why I've never written anything set in space, frankly. But you're going to need to do research into, methods of space travel and things like that, and decide what's the one that you're going to work for you, or may need to invent faster than light travel or something like that. But it does need to have some solid factual grounding so that readers will have something they can believe in. Because if you're asking readers to believe in something like Cinder, where a cyborg goes to the ball and loses her whole foot, if you're asking for someone to believe in a bear that can be transformed into a man, or a theater professor who's actually a fairy, then you need to have a solid grounding otherwise. In order to believe that the theater professor is really a fairy or something like that, I need to believe that these kids are actually at college, they go to class, they study, they have to do their laundry, things like that. And in order to believe that this spaceship can really take off, I need to have some scientific facts that make sense to my little unscientific brain, at least, so that I can follow the rest of the story and believe in interstellar wolves attacking Little Red or something like that. So make sure you do the amount of research you need for your book. How much you do and how you set it, that's up to you. Go with your gut instinct. Make sure that you get some good feedback, especially if you're writing about something that you are not familiar to. If you have zero scientific background, and you are setting something in space or very far in the future, you may want to talk to someone who has a better grounding in the sciences and get them to take a look at your manuscript and tell you where you're going too wrong. Ditto if you have never been to Indonesia and you want to set the story in Indonesia. First of all, why? If you don't have any experience there, but you may want to get a reader who's from Indonesia to read your story and tell you how it works, if there's any cultural appropriation you need to be careful of. If you are going to use quotes from lots of medieval German sources and things like that, and you speak no German, let alone Middle High German, you may want to look into getting someone, contacting a professor or something like that to maybe help you out, make sure that your quotes aren't just dirty limericks and they are in fact beautiful romantic poetry. But do the amount of research that you need to do. The other thing you need to do for research is make sure that you're researching the right story. I call this portion of the talk, which is almost over, so if I don't want to lose anyone, but I call it, is it real or is it Disney? I love Disney, huge Disney fan, but they have in fact changed many of the fairy tales that they told, in fact most of them, in order to make them more accessible to younger kids and not terrify them to pieces. And we now think of that as being the standard. That has become the way we tell Cinderella. That's the way we tell Sleeping Beauty. Those stories are extremely different. Even Sleeping Beauty, I thought I knew, she actually is asleep for 100 years and behind the thorns in the original story, and it's when the thorns die off after 100 years and she wakes up naturally that the prince finds her. And I knew that much, but I actually did think her name was Briar Rose or Aurora, and it is not. And so looking into the story, I found a whole lot of differences that I had assumed were not Disney that actually are. And just some things like that. The fairy godmother in Cinderella I don't think existed until Disney. Lots of things like that. And so you're going to want to look into your story and read a couple of different sources, read a couple of different versions, as old as you can find, for your legends, for your stories, for your folk tales, to make sure that what you're looking at in the story you want to tell is actually the correct story, and that you're not just copying Walt Disney, who was great, and we love him, but he did, in fact, make fairy tales be for children when they really, really weren't. So that is also something to look for. If you are looking for what I call my fairy tale master list, which is this beautiful list containing my top favorites in fairy tale retellings, including some wonderful little gems like Stork by Wendy Del Sol, which goes off the legend of the stork delivering babies in a delightful way, and Fire and Hemlock by Diana Wynne Jones. That list is on my blog. It's not the most recent blog post, because who knows when you're seeing this video, but if you go in and search the tags for fairy tales, you'll find the fairy tale master list, and that is a list of my current favorites. Also, if you subscribe to my newsletter, Jessica Recommends, I periodically do send out a newsletter of favorite fairy tale retellings because they are so dear to my heart. So, good luck everyone, and happy writing.